Hello, honeys, and welcome to Concrete Memories. This episode is going to be a little more conceptual. We're going to be asking a lot of questions, and I'll be giving you my interpretations. But of course, you can and should form your own opinions. And with that in mind, our first question of the day: how do you capture something fleeting? Our focus today is on physical monuments made to the fleeting. We will be talking about how we use materials, especially the dense and weighty-in-all-senses one of concrete, to capture something intangible and something as ephemeral as memory. Of course, memory is associated with the abstract, with the mind, but it can also be a physical thing, a memento, for example, a photo, a story, a written narrative. But like every possible theme, concept, and subject, it has also made its way into the fine arts to be represented through drawings, sculpture, multimedia installations, many different formats, and many different associated opinions over the years. But today we're going to focus on those specifically made out of concrete because it's extremely durable, it's lasting, modern, immovable, and requires precise fabrication processes. This makes any concrete work inherently feel different from one made of, say, marble, which might feel traditional, timeless, refined, or wood, which may be more warm, natural, and cozy, or any other material. So even though the material of concrete and the idea of memory seem like very oppositional ones, we're going to look today at where they come together and how that influences the resulting artworks. It's been a fat minute since we did a little reminder about our sources, so if you're curious, you can find the source document with every single one listed out in our episode description. If you're curious about some of today's, they include the Tate Britain, the Guggenheim, the Gagosian, Forbes, and many more. And with all that said, honeys, let's dive in. We're going to take a case study sort of format like we did in the ATPPO series today, because it'll make a little more sense and allow us to move through all the different interpretations of this crossroads. Our first artist and artwork today, Rachel Whiteread. An artist I have long found very compelling. She's born in London, and her parents' interests in art and architecture had a big impact on her childhood, her understanding of forms and material, and this only continued to grow when she was building a studio out of part of their house with her father as a teen. Whiteread went on to study painting at Brighton Polytechnic and sculpture at the Slade School of Fine Art, both in the 80s. She had her first solo exhibition at the Carlyle Gallery in London in '88, which included the sculpture Torso, one of our works for today that we'll circle back to. But proceeding chronologically, she was the first woman to win the Turner Prize in 1993, also won the Best Young Artist at the 1997 Venice Biennale, very prestigious awards. She continues to live and work in London and is considered one of Britain's leading contemporary artists. Although Whiteread has also produced a number of drawings, she's best known for her sculptural casts. But these aren't any ordinary casts, they're reversed. So the objects that she is casting become unusable and impractical. They force the viewer to think about the meanings of these permanent but uncanny objects and structures. An example of what I mean by this reverse casting is she might fill a given familiar object, say a tea kettle, with cement. Then she will break away the tea kettle and only have that cement impression as the actual art piece. I don't think she's actually done a tea kettle specifically, but that's to give you an idea of how this works. The National Gallery of Art specifically notes that she focuses on memorializing everyday objects, domestic interiors, and public spaces. There's an emphasis on human touch and occupancy in her works as well. Specifically of her drawings, the Hammer Museum at UCLA notes that they're largely not meant for public display, but act more as a journal of ideas as well as in-depth reflections on her works. She herself has referred to them as a, quote, diary of my work, end quote. And now, since we're talking about the art officially, we can circle back to Torso from 1988. It is one of a technically unfinished ongoing series, and these are significantly the only works in her oeuvre that make direct anthropomorphic reference because they are casts of hot water bottles. They look, in some ways, creepily like human bladders. The torso sculptures, however, are better known for marking the widely recognized start of her use of domestic items, especially as she, at the early stages, would occasionally leave pieces of the thing cast visible in these new forms. The hot water bottles, as a thing that both lays on us and that we lay on, is very similar in some ways to other objects that she casts, from mattresses to sinks, in that they have this intimate physical relationship to the body. For that reason, Tate Britain calls her a minimalist with a heart. As important as the torso sculptures were to her development, a 1993 artwork is in fact the one that launched her to fame. Titled House, it was built and came down the very next year, 1994. So what's the story here? House was cast from a literal entire Victorian terrace house. It was done after all the other terraces in this row had been demolished on government orders to create more open green spaces in the local vicinity. Once this particular residence was the only one left, the longtime owner, Sidney Gale, was evicted and rehoused by the local council. At that time, Whiteread obtained approval from both parties to enter and to cast the condemned structure. Now, how they did this, the making process, is also kind of fascinating in terms of and reconstructing memory. They casted the walls in concrete and created a system of interior metal armature supports, then removed the exterior of the house, according to the artist, brick by brick, leaving only the hardened concrete visible. She described the process as messy and exhausting, with its start in August of 93 and end in late October of that year. I was surprised to read that she also invested in quite a bit of security to make sure that the project kept on plan and did not get damaged. Upon completion, House sat on the original property site as a standalone reminder of the working class homes that had once spanned that street. And here's where we start to get a little conceptual, get into the meaning behind it, so make sure your brains are firing on all cylinders. A very popular artwork trope is to force us to think about what's missing through absence. This changes that narrative, the entire look and feel of the project, by creating a close enough thing instead of leaving a blank slate. It is an unexpected solidification of the usually invisible air that occupies the space within rooms. This ghostliness of this inside-out looking remnant is heightened by the fact that House could not be entered in any way. So because Whiteread filled the negative space with the positive, with concrete, she uniquely allows us to remember not the shape of what was, but the actual space that our bodies occupied. All in all, this work is about the interior instead of the facade. The literal lost walls ask us what it means to expose the private, the internal, what it means to remove structures, or at least those we are familiar with and expect. In a way, this work is also about presentation of what is usually hidden, what is usually left to the imagination, and even things that might make us look bad. Here we have no choice between internal and external because it is all interior, starkly so. As I mentioned, it was ultimately destroyed by the city, but it enjoyed a moment in the spotlight first. Everybody in London wanted to see it, it seemed, and just about everybody in London, it seemed, also had thoughts. Artsy.net claimed that it was briefly a hot tourist destination, but more importantly, it inspired heated debates around issues of real estate, class divisions, and urban sprawl. While some locals loved it, others were very angry that, quote, while they struggled to pay for their own flats, an unlivable structure had received significant attention and funding, end quote. This was definitely intentional. White Reed wanted her viewers to think about people who could no longer go home because of government removal. But some people thought its statement was so significant that, as White Reed told The Guardian in 2007, some fans wanted it to become permanent. Some were even lobbying for that in Parliament. As she noted, it was a rare moment of publicity in the art world. In the end, the local government voted to demolish the artwork 10 days early, so it went down after a total of only 80 days standing. Though many were disappointed with this decision, White Reed knew that the lease was temporary and it would be knocked down sometime, but the experience of seeing it fall was worse than she expected. And let's get philosophical again. This destruction provides a fascinating twist on the so-called foreverness of concrete and on the idea of a monument or memorial at all. There's a bit of a meta factor to this. Because it was highly publicized, including TV news coverage of the destruction, we have footage as another sort of memory of house, even if we don't have the original standing concrete sculpture. So though one memory is gone, a version of it remains. The more important questions that still get tossed around in art history classes today, though, center on the whys here. Why is it that this particular memory, this particular memorial was destroyed? Because it's no longer useful or relevant? Because it made somebody look bad? Because it itself looks bad, literally ugly? There are lots of potential answers, and we will never be able to land on exactly which one it is, as it's likely a combination of all of them. In any case, House provides one of the most interesting studies in concrete memories in artistic terms that there ever was. Our next memorial/concrete memory is one that I've actually been to myself and found very calming, and maybe it was the sunshine that day, but even a little hopeful. It is indeed the National September 11th Memorial and Museum. Located at the former site of the World Trade Center in New York City, it tells the day's story through media narratives, collections of monumental and authentic artifacts. Its design came out of an April 2003 international competition for a permanent memorial by the Lower Manhattan Development Corporation, which was established to oversee the bouncing back, essentially, of the downtown area after the attacks. The competition ended with over 5,200 submissions from 63 countries. Entries were judged by a 13-person jury, and the winner was announced in January of 2004. Those winners were architect Michael Arad and landscape architect Peter Walker for their design reflecting absence. Talking construction for a minute, it began in August of 2006 when the World Trade Center Memorial Foundation and the port authorities of both New York and New Jersey began heavy construction on the memorial and museum. It opened on the 10th anniversary of 9/11. If you've never been there yourself, the design is twin waterfall pools about an acre in size, and that did, honeys, actually help me figure out what in the hell an acre is, sat in the former building's footprints. These pools contain the largest man-made waterfalls in North America. Each drops 30 feet into a square basin, then another 20 feet into a smaller central void. This void, in actuality, is where the water recirculating system is housed, but the idea behind it is much more conceptual and significant. It's meant to show that the water can literally never fill this void, that the loss of those who perished can never be filled. That cascading water is meant to make these pools a separate place of reflection from the rest of the city, and it does a pretty great job of that. There's something almost mesmerizing about the sound that allows you to really focus on the memorial, on the names that are presented alongside it. And those names are listed on the bronze parapets that surround these pools. The names are grouped by the locations and circumstances in which victims of both 9/11 attacks and the 1993 World Trade Center bombing died during them. A next-of-kin approved system of so-called meaningful adjacencies was also implemented, meaning that friends were grouped with friends, crewmates with each other, first responders, colleagues, so on. My first question for your thinking caps is how is a memorial to something that happened in living or recent memory different from an older one? Furthermore, how might the experience of someone visiting this memorial who had seen the attacks on TV be different from someone visiting this memorial who was in the city of New York at the time of the attacks? I thought a lot while I was there about how this monument probably felt different to me, that somber yet hopeful feeling, knowing that I was too young to remember the attacks when they happened, and thinking about all the adults around me who probably were in shock and panicking at that time. I wondered how their interactions with the memorial were different based on their own memories. This memorial also forms a bit of a counterpoint to Right Read in that this is a case of absence. It's especially striking that in this city filled with skyscrapers, this is a space that goes into the ground. It increases that sense that something is missing, that something is very different in this space. Whereas Right Read's house was a bit more of an acknowledgement of something that was, I would say that the 9/11 memorial is a memorial to something that never will be again. Next up, the less popularly known Yugoslavian concrete structures. So what they are, technical term is actually spomenik. They're abstract memorials built during the reign of the former Yugoslavian president Josip Broz Tito from the 1960s to the 1970s. He commissioned them while in office to celebrate the defeat of Axis forces in World War II, commemorating sites where battles took place or where concentration camps were located. They were designed by various architects and sculptors, but all are massive concrete structures intended to convey the power of the socialist republic that the Yugoslav was at that time. Some of the more famous names among them include Bogdan Bogdanovic, Juraj Neidhart, and Svetlana Kana-Redovic. The structures also take every sort of shape imaginable, from smashed-together cubes to abstract flowers to tower-like forms or even wing-like structures. All, however, are non-functional. The MoMA describes them as, quote, a manifestation of the radical diversity, hybridity, and idealism that characterize the Yugoslav state itself, end quote. Thus, it's a nationalized, post-war architecture distinct from other approaches across the EU and even the world. They form a more sculptural counterpart to the architectural self-fashioning style going on at that time. For some examples of what I mean by the architectural style they were forming, you can look to famous hotels like the Zlatibor, meant to evoke a rustic Serbian communal village habitation, aka a zadruga. For a specific example, let's take a look at the wing set pieces by artist Miodrag Zivkovic from the early 1970s. The wings mark the heart of a monument to the Battle of Sujecka. This is the site where Tito's forces began to win against the Nazis and the turning point of the war. Although it was once a popular spot amongst Yugoslavians for homage, prayer, etc., it is noted today as lonely and grubby by CNN, who also reported graffiti on parts of the memorial hall below. A lot of our conceptual themes and questions for today are centered in the important historical context of these works. The first thing to acknowledge is that, according to Hyperallergic, Yugoslavia was more of a construct than a real nation post-World War II. It was made up of 6 distinct, primarily rural republics with 2 autonomous regions that spoke 5 languages and occupied territory about the size of Ohio. Though authoritarian at the end of the day, Tito's Yugoslavia aimed to find a quote-unquote third way between the stricter Soviet socialism and the seemingly glamorously free post-war America. This meant that a rush of building activity swept through a still largely rural society that only a few years earlier was under Axis occupation in the middle of the war. These concrete structures were a way to combine the ideas of the time and experiment with elements of both socialism and capitalism through low-cost, malleable material experiments. Though short-lived, this was a time of relative prosperity, and the concrete structures are a result of that. So how might they have continued to evolve if things had gone differently in the nation? How does the meaning of a monument change when it refers to different lengths of time? For example, some of these structures refer to the entire war, and some refer to a single day of attack, others a battle. Are there different forms or symbols that are more appropriate for one versus another? And speaking of, how do the different looks of every single one of these sculptures change how quote unquote memorial seeming they feel? While some appear more somber, others appear more hopeful, and they seem to convey different messages in that sense. Although CNN describes them as a, quote, bold way of expressing the country's difference and the difference between the cultures of its constituent republics with energy, imagination, and panache, end quote, I personally am not entirely sold on the idea. Many of our sources mentioned that Yugoslavia's unique geographical position allowed it to gain and express influences from the Middle East as well as North Africa, but I found myself asking, can we really see these differences when comparing to US or Soviet sculpture from the time, or do we just know that there should be one? What exactly are these ideas that we're supposedly passing through and being experimented on? The very abstract forms of the monuments make that question almost impossible to answer, and thus it's harder to really get a sense of what influences came from where. As much as I want you to dwell on those questions, the timeline does keep moving forward, and so must we. So we arrive at 1967, and this is a big year for the Yugoslav. It's the first one that foreign visitors can enter the nation without a special visa, leading to a huge boom in tourism. So we have to ask, honeys, how might the desire to feed into tourist interests, the desire to capitalize on this boom, have affected the timing and the production of these concrete structures? Were they made for the Yugoslav and its people, or was it a bit more complicated than that? Getting even closer to today, the Yugoslav wars of the 1990s brought widespread destruction or at least abandonment of many of these and other concrete, largely hotel projects and structures. Today, many sit uncared for and in not too great of states. So the obvious question is, how do we determine what memories are important when, and what memorials for that matter? When resources are spread thin, what memories are worth protecting and preserving? Again, we must ask the same thing of these memorials, these monuments. Another heavy-hitting memorial that fits our themes today, the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, Germany. It was designed by American Peter Eisenman, born 1932, who is often characterized as a deconstructivist. What that term essentially means is he's into fragmentation, not about harmony, no continuity, not about symmetry either. Eisenman rose to fame in the late 1960s as part of the New York Five, which was a group that shared an interest in the so-called purity of the architectural form. It is located near the Brandenburg Gate and is actually titled The Memorial to the Murdered Jews of Europe. Designed as a place of remembrance and commemoration for the over 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, it is the most central memorial of the nation. So, backstory time. Even in the late 1980s, demands arose to build a memorial to European Jewish people, but location, form, the message, discussions around all that dragged out for nearly 10 years. In the spring of 1995, the Berlin Senate administration announced the first artistic competition, and in 1997, a second competition was announced. Of course, this is the competition Eisenman won, though his designs had to be edited several times before they were built. The memorial officially opened in early May of '05. The most famous section is the one that we're going to focus on, the Field of Stele. The field covers over 19,000 square meters with over 2,700 concrete forms with an average weight of about 8 tons apiece. They stand on a gently but irregularly lowered site. It's immersive on all sides once you actually walk in between the stelae, but this wave-like shape across the tops looks different from each spot within the so-called maze. This effect is meant to force a sense of disorientation, to consider each stele as a unique within the whole and encourage discussion of the experience. It is complemented by a museum section that provides basic historical and context information, as well as more thematic and in-depth rooms. One of the most important reasons for this field shape is that the movement through it is meant to mimic the real-life experience of Holocaust victims. Going deeper in makes you less connected to others who may be experiencing similar or slightly different things based on where exactly in the field they're located. The sense of gravity that the field and each stele in it gives is meant to concern us with the gravity of the events that inspired this monument. Here's where the story gets really interesting though, honeys. It faced a ton of mixed reactions, and a lot of them relate specifically to how memory was interpreted here. We'll get it over with and say it. There are some to whom this resembles a cemetery with the steles as headstones, and some see that as a good thing, some do not. The memorial has faced a lot of criticism over the years for its name as well as its content. The name criticism mostly comes from its partial specificity. It doesn't necessarily say which murdered Jewish people, murdered by who. No real explicit Holocaust reference is made in that title. Some see this as an over-collective approach. The Jewish people here are reduced to groups, numbers, etc. as they were in Holocaust. Their actual names are not on these steles, but are available in a separate and supposedly not very accessible part of the museum. Richard Brody writes very clearly in The New Yorker a good explanation of this. Quote, "The assumption of this familiarity, the failure to mention it at the country's main memorial for the Jews killed in the Holocaust, separates the victims from their killers and leaches the moral element from the historical event, shunting it to the category of a natural catastrophe. The reduction of responsibility to an embarrassing tacit fact that everybody knows is the first step on the road to forgetting," end quote. We have, in fact, heard from the designer relatively recently regarding some of these criticisms, so let's refer to his 2020 interview statements. He expressed that the idea was to move specifically away from Jewish symbolism and focus instead on a larger picture of being lost in or to space and time. He says, quote, "I wanted a field of otherness where people understand that to have been a Jew in Germany was other, and what it was like to be other," end quote. He based that intended effect, sense of being lost and not knowing where to move or go, from a survivor's own Auschwitz story, and for that reason intentionally made it big, distorted feeling, and strange. It's all about the movement and not necessarily so much about those stele sculptures. So it is very possible that that's what critics pick up on and don't like, that this design is about a broader concept than solely the Holocaust. To Eisenman, architecture is all about collective memory and should mark specific moments with specific architecture, and this style, in his eyes, references both the 40s as well as 90s architectural styles. In the interview, he explains his interest in the different perceptions about the memorial's purpose, as well as different experiences of it between younger and older people. He says he has thought a lot about how a grandchild might say to their grandparent, "I had a great time at the Holocaust Memorial," and how both sides would interpret that sort of statement. Here we see a bit of a parallel with the 9/11 Memorial in that there are differences in behavior and interactions with embodied memory depending on age, gender, whether you're alone or with other people. It demonstrates the range of emotions associated not only with a given memorial, but the memories behind it. Importantly, Eisenman said that this monument is not about guilt, should not be interpreted as such. He says, actually, quote, "The Germans who vote today are no more guilty than we are for voting Trump in," end quote. So another great opportunity to think about memory across time, how the meanings of things change, how the physical presentation in terms of a memorial or a monument can affect our experiences with or relationships to various historical events. Our second to last work for the day, Corbusier's Chandigarh. A small overview of Le Corbusier, in case you don't know him. He was born Charles Edouard Jeanneret in 1887. He was extremely functionally minded and believed even that houses were machines for living in, according to the MoMA. Also a prolific writer and lecturer, he put emphasis on geometric forms and the revolutionary abilities of reinforced concrete that were possible then and still have their influence today. Importantly, as time passed, he incorporated more organic forms like the ones seen in Chandigarh. He continued to design and realize these road-centric, extremely urban, gridded city plans through to his death. The city complex came to be when Corbusier designed the intended utopia with his cousin Pierre Jeanneret in 1947, post-independence. Because a new state capital of Punjab, located between India and Pakistan, was not only logistically necessary, it was hoped that by bringing in Corbusier and accomplishing this, they could show the world that India was modernized, prosperous, and independent. So, in 1950, he designs it, and the site was chosen 167.8 miles north of New Delhi. Though Corbusier got the credit, it was others who actually made it happen. The buildings were created by a collaboration between a Western team and a group of Indian architects and urbanists, who included the Pritzker Prize-winning architect Balkrishna Doshi, who brought traditional influence to the complex. It was largely built from concrete, and the metropolis uses his typical grid street patterns with European-style boulevards and lots of raw concrete buildings in combination with simplified Indian designs. Chandigarh shows Corbusier's desire to incorporate architecture, landscape, man, and nature into one. There actually is a lot of symmetry here, with complexes and zones arranged according to a body schematic. For example, the commercial center served as the heart and the capital with the government buildings as the head. We can touch briefly on memory here to note that the complex has a very similar layout and design principles as the cities of New Delhi, Paris, and Beijing. So the concept of memory shows up here as a noticeable impact on creative results, a sort of visual parallel déjà vu to other places in the world. And as Corbusier was French, it's almost guaranteed that those memories of Paris played an influence on the designs. One of the fascinating things about this complex is that the memory of one of the biggest moments of drama during its creation that changed how we see it today is relatively scarce. Corbusier was disappointed and insulted even at how his plans for residential towers were limited or even outright shut down by the local government. So he changed the designs as a middle finger back to them. The late 1951 master plan puts the Capitol complex buildings within clear lines of sight with the rest of the city. It would have been framed by the Himalayas in the background. But after this so-called betrayal, Corbusier puts artificial hills between those buildings and the rest of the mini-city of Chandigarh to separate them explicitly so that the former could not be seen. So even though it changed the entire nature of the complex, this story is relatively lost to time. The physical what is still there, but the intangible why is not. Another connection point to memory can be made by talking about how Corbusier was actually not the first on this job. The original designers were intended to be Americans Albert Mayer and Matthew Novicki, but after the latter suddenly died in a 1950 plane crash, Mayer stepped down. Corbusier made notable changes like compressing Mayer's 6,900 acres down to 5,400, increasing the density of the city by 20%. As Corbusier worked on it until his 1965 death, the complex brings up the human ability to encapsulate legacies in monuments, making associations between people, dead or alive, and places and things based on memory through these physical remnants. At the same time, it's a give and take. Corbusier is very well known, Mayer and Novicki, not so much. It was constructed using Garden City principles, which are recognizable for their emphasis on ample green spaces between roads and buildings, that was requested by the local government. But looking at photos of the complex, I was reminded very strongly of ultra-contemporary and eco-brutalist styles. That got me thinking that memory kind of comes back around just like architectural styles. As time passes, we look back and we reconnect. Its state today brings up even more questions about memory. It has been very widely celebrated by the architectural field and even been popular and influential in the state of India itself. What makes things complicated is essentially population growth. Architecture Daily notes, quote, "Despite the inevitable growth of the city beyond its original rectangular borders, Chandigarh continues to hold the admiration and affection of locals and the international architectural community. Long after his and Le Corbusier's deaths, the Punjabi capital continues to serve as, in the first Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru's words, quote, an expression of the nation's faith in the future," end all quotes. Although it serves as this iconic unifying symbol for the nation, the complex faces the dual challenge of preserving its modernist heritage while adapting to the changing needs of an ever-increasing population. So the question is, how do we prioritize current needs and/or memory monument preservation? How can we blend old and new when we need to? How can sparking memory make that happen? It's a conundrum of past versus present, even a little bit versus future. These questions and more surround the complex to this day, and I personally am curious to see how they continue to be addressed in the future. And our final concrete memory for today, honeys, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park's A-bomb dome. Obviously, this is a memorial park in the center of Hiroshima dedicated to the legacy of the city as the first nuclear bomb site in the world, as well as to the memories of the bombing's up to 140,000 direct and indirect victims. It was planned and designed by the Japanese architect Kenzo Tang at Tang Lab in what used to be the city's busiest commercial and residential district. Called the Dome today, it is actually the skeletal ruins of the former Hiroshima Prefectural Industrial Promotion Hall, which was completed in April of 1915. The A-bomb dome is the building closest to the hypocenter of the nuclear bomb that was still left partially standing, and it was left as was in memory of the casualties. Though it seems impossible for the building to have survived, there are many reasons it did. First, it's in Japan. They build to resist earthquakes in the first place. Second, the explosion of the bomb was almost directly overhead, which allowed the force to travel through the vertical pillars without destroying them. The energy instead blew out the walls of the building and damaged its foundations. Shortly after the bombing, it was slated to be demolished with the rest of the ruins, but its relatively intact state delayed the demo long enough for it to become a local controversy. Some wanted it torn down, but others wanted to preserve it as a memorial of the bombing and a symbol of peace. When city reconstruction ultimately began, it was preserved. Between 1950 and 1964, the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park was established around the dome, and it itself has undergone 2 minor preservation projects to stabilize the ruin, mostly between October 1989 and March of 1990. The dome is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and the story behind that is a little unique. Many A-bomb survivors and Hiroshima citizens were pushing for it to be registered as it was, quote, a symbol of horror and nuclear weapons and humankind's pledge for peace, end quote. What began as a collective citizens petition was given bigger weight when the Japanese government officially recommended the dome to the World Heritage Site Committee in December of 1995. It was granted the status for not only the reasons given, but also for its ability to symbolize the insanely destructive power of nuclear war and how humankind can wield that or permanent peace. The addition was confirmed in December of 1996. We've asked so far this podcast what it means for someone to encounter a memorial to something they experienced versus a memorial of something that happened outside their lifetime. We're presented here with something entirely new. People demanding a memorial for something they experienced. The addition of this site to the UNESCO list really shows how important collective memory and collective advocating for memories is, how much power that can hold. There's also an interesting dynamic between state and personal memory here. The nation of Japan may very well have wanted a memorial monument for many reasons related to World War II, as well as the dropping of the A-bombs, but those reasons might be very different from the reasons of someone who was living in a town on the outskirts of Hiroshima at the time. And that's a good segue into our final thoughts section. So here we go. The A-bomb dome is kept permanently in a state of preserved ruin as a reminder of the destructive effects of nuclear warfare. This monument is our only ruin for the day, so I'll ask you, how does it feel different from the ones we've talked about previously? There's an argument to be made about how there's different emotional pulls for visible versus invisible damage. Scars we can see versus scars we only know about. There's a huge difference between something like the A-bomb dome that was pre-existing and shows the real ruined state, the effects, and something like reflecting absence at the 9/11 memorial, which is something new, something rebuilt with a lot of acknowledgement of the past, but no signs of the damage. Another important consideration of the A-dome and its meaning is that it sits back from the rest of the park a bit in an inaccessible section. This blunt physical separation leads us to wonder what exactly are the ideas that this ruin or any others connect to. Is it meant to relate to how things we lost can't be returned to? Is it meant to say something about how things endure? The inaccessibility may even make us think about things that other people have touched and used. All in all, a lot of a different meaning and tone to something that can be interacted with, like the Field of Sele at the Holocaust Museum. And our last but possibly most important point, what was the reality after this status was given? Have we honored and kept this memory of peace that it was dedicated to? We can also ask if the building would mean less if UNESCO had not granted official recognition of it. We must remember that its World Heritage List dedication marker reads in part that it was granted status, quote, as a symbol that vows to faithfully seek the abolition of nuclear weapons and everlasting world peace, end quote. Because of that and its historical associations, it's a very popular venue for anti-war, anti-nuclear weapons, and anti-nuclear power movement protests in Japan. It is also the site of an annual peace memorial ceremony by the municipal government. So there's an interesting way in which the memory is being honored in some of the way that it's being used when it's hosting these protests. But on the bigger scale, its aims of inspiring memory to promote peace and anti-nukes, I think it's fair to say, less successful. All right, honeys, those are our concrete memories, the memorials, monuments, and buildings that make them up. I hope if there is one takeaway that you can get from this episode, it's that the act of anchoring beliefs, goals, histories, intangible objects is an important and continuous part of humanity. Embodiment, the creative process of making something for a purpose, is very significant. And it's important to think about how these sites, as well as objects, remind us, especially when it comes to ceremonies and protests. Because as I'm sure I don't have to tell you, honeys, these aims, beliefs, goals, all of it, still relevant, still in progress today. And that is where I will leave you for this week. Be sure to catch our business on Tuesday. Take care of yourselves, stay hydrated, stay cool, and catch you on the flip side. This podcast and this episode were created, produced, hosted, and researched, as well as fact-checked by yours truly, Celia Bugno. It was edited by our brand new sound engineer and producer of our intro music, Chris Meinhold. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe on all of your favorite streaming platforms as well as your social medias.